Okay, I think I can see everyone now, and hopefully I don't have any more disturbances. I'm actually trying to cut off different pieces of internet from the house, and I'm just hoping that I end up doing and getting a really good feedback on the video stream. I hope everyone is doing well today. I'm not going to start quite yet. I'm going to give some people a chance to get here. If you can, just please uh, let me know you're here. Let me know you're watching. Say something in the chat box for me, and I will say hi. See me okay? Sorry, I'm talking to my wife. Right now, I'm just messing with all the stuff that's going on. There we go. That's why it's not. No, that is not it either. Don't you hate whenever you feel like you get everything all figured out and then it just starts up and starts giving you some issues? I hope everyone can hear me okay. Just giving it just a small little overview of the things that I have set up right here. Let me go ahead and put myself back in the video. Okay, I hope everyone can hear me now. It's 7:02, and now I think that everyone has sound, and I can view everyone okay. No, now there's sound. I just turned it on. Okay, sorry about that. I'm gonna put in the. Somebody said no sound. Got it working. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Let me go ahead and just give a recap. The first class, and actually our last class that we went into, we discussed how God's reality and man's reality are two completely different things. I gotta wait. I have to wait, baby. Hang on. It's not going to come up if the stream is slow. We discussed how God's reality and man's reality are two different things. Man has this tendency to create a reality for himself. Some instances that we notice, that we see today, they give man this opportunity to create a reality for themselves. Sometimes it is a fixed reality. Video games are a source that man uses. Sometimes what we see in a video game is when someone dies, they respawn maybe about 5 minutes later, and then afterward, we notice that that it keeps on happening. But see, man has this other tendency. We want to be in control of our own reality. Not only do we want to opt out any other choice of anyone else being able to control our reality, but we feel like we're in control. We want to be in control of that. So whenever God comes and shows his reality, sometimes it causes problems. Sometimes people get defensive. Sometimes it gets to a point to where we want to protect our own reality rather than accept what is actual. Well, here in John chapter, and actually this is just a recap, in John chapters 4 and 5, we notice that Jesus has used the physical needs of people as a way to bring up what is actual. The Samaritan woman at the well only understood from what she has experienced, a reality that allowed her to think that there is no other source of water. There's no other source of water to draw from. And Jesus comes over here and he's talking about this living water stuff. What are you talking about? We notice in the next chapter, in chapter 5, the man who's lame, the paralytic who goes to the pool of Bethesda, and he wants to get in the pool, but he can't find the way to get in the pool. He's tried everything else. There's nothing else that he could have done to try and be healed. And he results to the last part of his understanding is just that I can be healed if I could just get in this pool quickly enough. And then whenever he can't, because everyone would jump in before then, whenever the waters would stir up, we notice that he gives up. He feels hopeless. And he actually tells Jesus, whenever Jesus asks him, hey, do you want to get well? Well, he asks him this question. He responds, I have no one to put me in this water. And it seems like he gives up hope here. He gives up hope and he says, something as, well, I have no one to put me in. Pretty much in a sense of, in a nutshell, I'm going to be this way for the remainder of my life. I'm just going to have to accept it. But he has created a reality from himself based upon what he has already seen. So whenever Jesus came in, and Jesus, again, he has this way of showing not just what man thinks of his own reality, but he has this way of coming in and triumphing man's reality into something that is actual. See, God always has control of reality. He controls reality in a way to where it is always actual. It is actuality, the reality that God has. But is it actual for us even when it triumphs and disagrees with the reality that we've set for ourselves? So that's something we're going to learn today and talk about. A while back, I don't know if many of you are familiar with evolution. there's something that and just let me go ahead and just give a small story. Uh, there's something that people believe to exist about 250 million years ago, something called trilobites. And they're actually one of the most ancient creatures on Earth. And according to people who believe in evolution, they were actually here and also they were extinct 250 million years before man has even come into existence. Now, there was a discovery made one summer day in 1968. William J. Meister, an atheist and evolutionist, he made it a hobby to collect fossils of ancient animals. On June 1st, 1968, Meister was searching in the mountains of Utah and found a trilobite fossil that would change his life. Trilobites were in the same rock as human footprints. So what does this mean? It means that they existed at the same time. So as he breaks off this large 2-inch piece of rock, he hits it on the edge with a hammer, and it fell into his hand. And with the great astonishment, he found that one side of the footprint of a human being with trilobites, they were right in front of the footprint itself. Now, the other half of the rock slab, it showed this perfect mold of a footprint in the fossils, and amazingly, it was just confirmed and shown that the human at the time was wearing a sandal. So after he consulted with experts, people wanted to see this discovery, and it's actually been something that people have debated on about whether it's true, whether it's not true. And years later, after he dies, his widow actually wants to place this fossil in safekeeping so it could be displayed for other scientists that wanted to conduct further examination. She was approached by an evolutionist, a paleontologist also, who offered her a very large amount of money for the fossils. Whenever she asked him what he intended to do with the fossils, he responded to her and told her that he planned to destroy them so no one else could be deceived by the claims the rocks made. There was another institute, it was the Smithsonian Institute. A little bit later, we notice and we see that they also place a bid on the fossils, and whenever she asked the Institute what they planned to do with the fossils, they told her that they planned to keep them away and store them away from the public so that no one else could see them. But finally, there was a person who was a creationist, and he approached her with also wanting to make a bid on these fossils. She asked him she asked him what he planned on doing with the fossils, and he assured her that that he would put them on display. So she ended up giving him the fossils free of charge. But something that strikes me with this story, what do you think of this person's approach to this subject here? There are these people here that have this piece of evidence that's completely shaken what people have originally accepted and believed about things. But what they do is they don't just approach this subject with wanting to learn from the evidence that they have now. They want to approach it in a way to where it is actually determined on these biases that they've already had, these understandings that they've already developed from other things that they've come to a knowledge on. But pretty much there's no amount of evidence that would agree, or there's no amount of evidence that would persuade them otherwise. Instead of accepting it and going at it with an honest heart and saying, well, hey, I want to study this more thoroughly, it has to be thrown out because it goes against something that they always believed. There's a quote from a book called Muscle and a Shovel. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But the quote says, it is easier to believe something that we've heard 1,000 times rather than to believe something we've never heard before. But there are those here in John chapter 6 who approach Jesus with this approach of religious practices. There are those who approach religious practices for Jesus Christ in the same way that we notice here in this last story that was said. But they come to Jesus looking for him to match whatever mold or pattern that they have created and set for him. And when he doesn't measure up and when he doesn't provide the evidence that that supports their theories or their understandings of what they already believe about him. They throw it out and they try to hide it away or allow people to destroy it. And sometimes it just destroys people's faith altogether. Let me get a drink of coffee. But sometimes it destroys people's faith altogether. In John chapter 6, Jesus actually deals with these such people. The account of the situations here that are encountered in John chapter 6, John chapter 4, we notice with the Samaritan woman. She had the wrong ideas about Jesus to satisfy only her physical needs and emotional needs, whenever he came for a bigger purpose and needed to satisfy the spiritual needs as well. The same thing that we notice here with the man in chapter 5, the one who was a paralytic. No one could satisfy his physical needs. He was trying to look in every place that he could to get healed of his paralysis, but he couldn't find anything. And he didn't even look to Jesus to do this. He didn't even know who Jesus was at this point. But we just notice that sometimes here in John chapter 6, whenever Jesus points out and does all these miracles and stuff, it was for a different purpose. People wanted to seek the physical, rather than tune in and really examine the miracles and the meaning behind them and what Jesus was actually trying to say. Let me go ahead real quick and put up this. Let me take this away. This is a link to the story that I just brought up here not too long ago. And let me take this away too. Let me, if I could take this out. This is the PowerPoint that I have. But anyway, this is that link that goes to the story I just said. And I'm not saying that I've done my study on this link right here and the study behind it. It's just to find application. So those of you who are viewing that are skeptical, man, please, I encourage you, do the study yourself. It is nothing in that I have in no way went and have done thorough research on. You take it how you want. We're going to go ahead and look into this next quote that I have here. This actually comes from the Morris commentary in pages 346 and 47, but he quotes a man named R.F. Bailey, and the quote says, "He who is already king has come to open his kingdom to men, but in their blindness men try to force him to be the kind of king they want. Thus they fail to get the king they want and also lose the kingdom he offers." So let me go ahead and take this away. Now we're going to go ahead and start. Again, my lesson is over the reality of the reality in the Gospel of John, but it is also over felt needs versus real needs. We as creation and God's creation have real needs, have felt needs that we often look to Jesus for. But when Jesus came here to the earth, even though he does miracles to satisfy the physical needs of people, they were only a shadowing of the great things that were to come. So God satisfies the real needs, but he wants people to understand that and his whole reason of sending Jesus. In all these other different places, these people want to seek Jesus just for the physical, but Jesus is saying, come to me for everything, the physical and the spiritual. Physical things will be temporary, and they might temporarily fill us up, but we will start to hunger again because it's not what is spiritual. We were made to serve a spiritual God, worshiping him in spirit and in truth, which we noticed in our previous lessons beforehand. Okay, so the first slide, which is a sign of great truth, and we're looking at verses 1 through 15. John recorded here several signs that contrast Jesus and the new way of Jesus and the old way of Judaism. For example, Jesus' new wine made from water of ritual purification is far much better than the old wine. Those of us who are not familiar with Old Testament references, the wine that God had was either used for blessing or cursing, for judgment or for a way to show that God was going to bless his people. And in John chapter 2, we notice that there's the wedding feast And Jesus goes and he notices that the wine is empty. There's no more wine. So he goes and turns water into wine, but this is a symbolism showing that, in the Old Testament, the wine represented either blessing or cursing. But a wedding celebration was all about blessing. It was all about how God blesses His people, and there was also a referencing there showing that the wedding symbolizes how God is now in a good relationship with His people, and the wine being filled up symbolized that it is a constant blessing that God gives whenever His people are in this relationship with Him. But whenever the wine starts to run out, God also uses an Old Testament reference talking about His cup of wrath. It also talks about Him showing that whenever His cup of wrath is full and it's overflowing, He's about to bring judgment on another nation because of their sin. So it represents a time whenever His creation, or the Israelites, were not in a good relationship with Him. So whenever this wine was empty, the blessing wine means the cup of wrath is full and God's about to give them what they deserve for their sin. But in this understanding right here, coming back to the PowerPoint, Jesus' new wine made from water of ritual purification is far better than the old wine. This has this understanding that the wine that God provides in the Old Testament, it stops at times. There's times to where it runs out because of the sin problem that was there. But in this understanding with the new wine, Jesus provides grace. It provides a grace that is overflowing, that is just constant blessing, that never runs out. It is a symbolism and an understanding that His relationship with His people is far much better whenever we seek His eternal, Jesus as eternal, whenever we seek Him for the satisfaction of sin. God's wine, the cup of blessing, is constantly overflowing again. Going back, the next thing that I have here, Jesus' body is the new temple that will make the old one obsolete. Jesus said that I will destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. And it wasn't talking about the spiritual temple we know. It was talking about His body. It was talking about Himself. But now we notice that the temple of the Holy Spirit is us, and that the Spirit of God is now living in us. But it was also a shadowing when Jesus, it shows that whenever Jesus rose from the dead and uses this reference of an earthly temple, we notice that it makes this old one obsolete. This one is far much better than the old one because it is something that is placed within us. God's Spirit no longer dwells in a physical temple that is built by human hands. It is completely placed in the hearts and the hearts of God's creation. It is still physical but it is living with us. We no longer have to only worship God in a certain place. We can always go to Him in spirit. The next thing that I have here, the old ways of law keeping will not help a Pharisee enter the kingdom. He must be born anew. Worship will not be done completely by law keeping anymore. Worship is something that is done completely as a heartfelt figure, as a heartfelt understanding. In the Old Testament, God constantly shows people and tells people this is what you must do to worship. And this is also what you must do to be cleansed of sin. He offers sacrifices, etc. But also we notice a little bit later that in the New Testament, it is something that is completely done, which John chapter 4 verse 23, that is by spirit and in truth. God wants your heart. He wants your heart. He doesn't want you to worship Him with action and then your heart be far from Him. Otherwise it throws out this beautiful opportunity to worship God. So the next thing that I have here, just moving on, I'm kind of going through these a little quickly. The old ways of worshiping are being replaced by worship in spirit and in truth, heartfelt worship to God. So the next thing, and I'm going on to this new slide right here. A sign of great truth. This is one of the second themes that we have. We noticed that the first theme, going back to the first sign right here, the first theme that we have was always constituting and contrasting the new and the old. But now we actually see that John introduces these couple of different stories right here, showing how Jesus gives life. He is the living water that replaces the dead water the Samaritan woman was drinking. It is a water that is constant. The physical water will run out, but if you come to Jesus, He will may you never thirst again. The royal official's son was saved from a near death. That shows how Jesus fixes the death problem in him. The paralytic receives a healthy life. It also references here that not just do we seek and have the more healthier things in Jesus, but this also shows that He is here to satisfy every part of us that is physical as well as spiritual, and just Him giving health and giving him back his ligaments, bringing back and restoring his body is also another way of showing that He will not only bring life and physical life to our body, but also eternal life. The Son is the source of life, and both of these themes, newness and life, appear in chapter 6. So again, just a little bit of introduction there. Okay, so we'll go ahead and beginning in the text, and I don't mean to take too long with the introduction, but beginning in the text, let me go ahead and come back real quick. In the text in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15, Jesus satisfies an obvious need. Starting in verse 1, let me go ahead and read. It says, After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which was the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, Where shall we buy bread that these may eat? But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. So again, here Jesus satisfies an obvious need. Again, these people had come from a long way to see Jesus, to see the miracles that he was doing. So they come from a long way, and they're hungry, and now they're trying to figure out what they can do to feed all these people. It would be impolite for them to come all this way to see Jesus and him not have made any preparation for them. It was like that. That was how one must provide for those that come off from a long way. They were supposed to be the ones to provide, but now they're trying to figure out, okay, well, what should we do? How can we feed these people? But look how Philip responds to this. Jesus asks him, he says to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? So Jesus right here, he actually gives Philip a pop quiz. Now you would think by now that Philip would have already, and also the other disciples would have already understood what Jesus was up to, because a little bit later, verses 6 and 7, but this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him and said, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. But see, look at the bracket of their reality for a moment, because look at what they're trying to do. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. But here are some things to look at. There was an obvious need. You would think to know that they would understand what Jesus was up to by now, because every time he uses a chance to, and he goes to people who had physical need, he always used it as this opportunity to bring up the spiritual, but also look at how the answer for the need was met. It was Philip first, and Andrew and Simon. They all take a stab at it, and then filling the needs that Jesus presents him. But each person, look what they do. This is the bracket of their reality. Each person looks to their own resources to determine whether or not they can meet the need. But do you see the bracket part of it? Their reality and what they're able to understand, they're only able to use these resources. Even though all these other times Jesus pretty much showed this point to, hey, look for me, look to me to be provided for, they still had no idea how they were going to feed all these people, so they started to look to their own resources first, neglecting that Jesus was there. They should have already known. Look at the Old Testament. There's a couple of places where God has used man to provide, specifically bread. Now we're going to see a little bit later, going back to the PowerPoint, that Jesus feeds the multitude, 5,000 men plus women and children. And not only does he provide enough to satisfy the need, but he provides an abundance to the need. So a little bit later, which we notice here in the further verses, then Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number at about 5,000, and Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of fish, as much as they wanted. Notice how it doesn't say needed. So just think, he didn't just have enough to satisfy the hunger. He didn't just have enough to allow them to fill up on the fish that they had, but he also had enough to where they were able to gather as much as they wanted. But a little bit after, therefore, they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments of the 5 barley loaves. Again, a little bit later, this is verse 13. We skipped ahead a little bit. Fragments of 5 barley loaves, which left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, and we're not there yet, but just notice what's happening right now. They didn't just have enough to get full, they had over what they needed. When God provides you spiritually, he doesn't just do it enough to satisfy the spiritual need of the sin problem. He has enough to not just fill you up to where you have enough, but he also has enough that just in case you do run out, here are some extra, here are some that's overflowing for you to gather so that you don't need any more. But look at how God deals with that. He takes the sin problem away. He provides you with this grace that's overflowing, and that just constantly is so much to where it cannot run out. You have what you need. You're rich in God's grace. So let me go ahead and go back to this PowerPoint for a moment. Hopefully it's not confusing y'all, because it is kind of confusing me. But here are some people's responses to this reaction right here. Let me go away. The people's connection between the prophet of Deuteronomy was proper. Here we have a couple of examples. Let me go ahead and bring them up. See if I can pull them up. Is this it? Okay. So here in Exodus chapter 16, notice who they were looking for. This is the prophet of which God told them would come. In Exodus chapter 16, verse 4, the Israelites they're wandering in the wilderness, and then they're hungry, and God provides them with bread. And Exodus 16, let me go ahead and start reading. Verse 4, Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. So God used Moses in this way to provide the Israelites with bread. Now, another instance we see in the book of 2 Kings, Elijah here, or Elisha, when he purifies the pot that was contaminated. Some thought it was here the text says it was harmful. But this is also another instance to where God is using a prophet to provide bread, which then, the Israelites should strike of this understanding that, hey, okay, this is sort of what happened in the Old Testament. It says, Then they served it, and this is 4 verses 40 through 44. Then they served it to the men to eat. Now it happened as they were eating the stew that they cried out and said, Man of God, there is death in the pot. And they could not eat it. So he said, Then bring some flour, and he put it in the pot, and said, Serve it to the people that they may eat. And there was nothing harmful in the pot. Then the man came from Baal Shalisha, and brought the man of God bread of the firstfruits, 20 loaves of barley bread, and newly ripened grain in the knapsack. And he said, Give it to the people that they may eat. But his servant said, What? Shall I set this before 100 men? He said again, Give it to the people that they may eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over. Again, of course, he is prophesying about this time here in Jesus. So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over according to the word of the Lord. This confirms what the text says about the prophet, which we realize that's in Deuteronomy, who God says that later he would send. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 15 through 18, The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear according to all you desired of the Lord your God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, nor let me see this great fire anymore, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, What they have spoken is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I shall command him. We notice a little bit later in John chapter 14, not just with Jesus, but also whenever he promises to send the Spirit to his disciples, that the Spirit, we notice, will guide them into all things, all truth. First Peter, it talks about, or Second Peter, it talks about all things we needed pertaining to life and godliness. Let me go ahead and go back to the PowerPoint. What was the problem in this? What was the problem? Some of you may have already cheated and saw the answer to the problem, but what was the problem, which we see here in verse 14? Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. So again, what was the problem with this? What was the problem? Jesus is a king. But see, what was the problem with man trying to force the people, or force Jesus to be their king? The problem was, instead of allowing Jesus to interpret his will and what he wanted for them, even though they just figured out that not only was he a prophet from all the miracles that he was doing, but he was also a prophet that was doing the works of God, but instead of allowing him to interpret his purpose and the things that he wanted for them, what they did was they tried to get Jesus to fit into the bracket of their own reality and their own agenda. They tried to force him to become their king rather than just listening to the instructions, tuning into the signs and the miracles that were appearing before their very eyes, and tuning into the word of the Lord. This awesome understanding that this man is from God. Let me see what he wants and expects of me. We cannot do that. Sometimes this happens. We notice that this Jesus person is exactly who he says he is. You know, we also understand that God is this loving and all-powerful God, but he is also a just and a holy God. Even though he is loving and powerful, he still means what he says, that he will bring judgment onto those who do not obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, which we see in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. There are a couple of instances to where even though God is loving, God is also very much, in which we learned last class, it does please God to tell people about the things that will bring life to them, but also it does please God, because he's a righteous God, to bring justice on those who are the evildoers, on those who do not follow his word and the things that he wants us to do. So again, we have to make sure that we're not trying to get Jesus to fit into our reality. Are we trying to align God's reality, or our reality, up with God's reality, or are we just trying to align God's reality up with our reality? And whenever we realize that those two cannot cross between each other, and to where God expects one thing and we have something else, our own agenda, Are we going to fit ours in line with God's, or are we just going to throw God's out and ignore it and only just want to receive the benefits from his reality? Sometimes we only follow so close to Jesus enough to receive the benefits, but not so much to where it requires something of us spiritually as a Christian. Moving on, let me go back to the PowerPoint. So what was the problem? Instead of allowing Jesus to interpret his purpose for them, they wanted Jesus to conform to their own agenda. So this was the misguided reaction. The next thing that we see here, verses 22 through 24, let me go ahead and read that. On the following day, and again, I know we kind of skipped this gap. Don't worry, I'm going back to it. On the following day, when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other boat there, which that one which his disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone away alone. However, other boats came from Tiberias near the place where they ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they also got into the boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus. And when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" The crowd was thrilled about what Jesus did. They not only wanted to figure out how they could get more of Jesus, but they were also interested in seeking and following Jesus for a wrong reason. Let me go ahead and go back to this PowerPoint. Now, going back and actually looking beforehand, verse 15, notice, don't you think the disciples might have been caught up in the popularity about what was happening whenever, at least maybe all the things that everyone was seeing their teacher do? Just think, Jesus went away, and whenever they tried to force him to become king, he went away alone. He departed again to the mountain by himself alone. So the disciples actually stayed there with the crowd. But notice, whenever Jesus wasn't there, whenever they couldn't find him, maybe they thought that he was coming. But he ended up not coming. So they ended up leaving because there was a storm that came. But then, a little bit later here in 19, so when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." This epidemic that we see going around with the coronavirus and such, there's a lot of things that make us afraid. And whenever something goes against our reality and what we think is true, and whenever God reveals something that's actual about him, even though his reality is always actual, sometimes we question it a lot. We sometimes we're afraid of it. Like, man, I don't even want to trust that. How do I know it? We see Jesus here walking on water. That's never been done before. But now we're at a time to where we need to trust God. We need to trust Jesus. But the reality of it, that's actuality, contradicts our reality. Sometimes with all this stuff that we see going on in the world, we think, well, hey, maybe God's not in control. Maybe God doesn't exist. Maybe for some reason God is just this evil God because he's allowing all of these things, all of this bad stuff to happen. Or maybe we're just at a standpoint to where we put God in a box and really limit his power and limit how powerful he actually is, rather than understand completely what is actual, that he is as powerful and even more powerful than what we think him to be. He is more powerful than what he says that he is. He's all powerful, surpasses our understanding all the time. But sometimes when fear tries to come across people, Maybe we see things on the media, things on Facebook and other instances. We start noticing the fear rather than looking to Jesus who is walking on the water, who is saying that trust in me to be your reality. Don't allow your reality to be reality. Allow my reality to be reality because it is actual. So, it is I, do not be afraid. Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. So I don't know if this meant that as soon as Jesus got into the boat, he performed this miracle that allowed them to get to the land quickly, or was it just something that allowed Jesus to walk across the water and they still had to wait a little bit before? But it did say immediately, and if we notice the word immediately in the Bible, whenever someone was healed or when Jesus did a miracle, it was something that was done immediately. There wasn't very much time that went by to where the person had to wait for something to happen because it happened before their very eyes. So again, just that, I thought that was something good. So Jesus is, let me go ahead and turn PowerPoint back on. The crowd seeks Jesus in verses 22 through 34. But the multitude has great interest now in following Jesus. We noticed that, let me go ahead and get it. We notice that in verse 15 that they actually they had great interest in following Jesus. They actually also, what we notice here in verses 1 and 2, we notice that trip right there that they made to the day before to come and see Jesus, it was actually at about 10 miles or so. But now when they no longer find him on the east side of the lake, they immediately make the return trip in order to find the miracle worker. So again, they wanted to see they wanted to see more, right? It sounds like they were very interested. They wanted to do whatever they could, even if it meant going to extreme measures to try and locate this miracle worker here. When they finally locate Jesus, they were quickly surprised. They asked, Rabbi, when did you get here? Which we notice here in verse 25. But they didn't notice. He got there so quick, but they were unaware of the trip that he made by foot across the middle of the lake. This next part right here shows how Jesus responds to their question. He responds to them. Let me go back, no cheating. He responds to them the same way that he does the Samaritan woman. Now remember what the Samaritan woman said. As soon as, and again, he goes back to the heart of the matter. As soon as, actually, let me kind of go back to John chapter 4, right here. As soon as she asks him, as soon as she gives him, let me look at this part. Look at verse 16 in chapter 4. Actually, look at verse 14. But whoever drinks, and he's talking about this living water, she's mentioning this well that their father Jacob dug for them. And he tells her, whoever drinks of this well will never thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that he gives them from the well that he gives them, that he will give them life. But then a little bit later, he asks him, he asks her, go call your husband. But what he does is he tries to get to the heart of the matter first. Let me go ahead and bring my PowerPoint back up. He responded to them the same way he had responded to Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman. He ignores the question and speaks to the heart behind the words. Notice here in verse 6, we see, I tell you the truth, you are looking for me, in verse 26, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. But he responds to the Samaritan woman the same way. Nicodemus, not because you saw the miraculous signs, but because. Here's the heart of the problem. The people have to come to Jesus with the wrong motives. They came to him in a way to where they were not trying to understand him, to where it was trying to understand the miracles and the deeper meaning that was behind the miracles. They were only looking to Jesus to try and get their physical needs met. And what this does, and here's some actually, let me go ahead and again go back to this PowerPoint. Hopefully, again, it's not too distracting. But seeking Jesus for all the wrong reasons. They were seeking Jesus as a way to fill their bellies up. And this is what I mean by trying to fill their bellies up. They sought Jesus not just to fill their bellies, but they wanted Jesus to become this politician, or this earthly king, this person who promises them 2 chickens in every pot pretty much. They wanted only to look to him in a way to where it would satisfy the physical needs of their flesh. It wasn't just to look for it in a deeper meaning. They expected him to be a king to bring to them earthly prosperity. They knew that because there was more bread to spare and everyone went home full, then it also means that in the same way that he can also provide other things maybe that would fill them up to where they would not be in need anymore. So pretty much, there's actually this quote in the Hendrickson commentary. It says, "Stop yearning for bread cakes and the like," and explains how Jesus, as if physical food would ever be able to fill the void in your heart. Realize that this food perishes, it has no abiding value. But instead, the real food which produces and sustains everlasting life, this is the food I, the Son of Man, will give. I will give myself for those among you who believe in me. This isn't supposed to mean, Jesus, please continue to give me everything that I ask here, because most of the time it's spiritual. When God tries to it's physical, and when God tries to do his best to try and get us to focus on the spiritual, sometimes we throw that away and we don't really care about it because it's something that we, from our own reality, think can't fill us up. The second thing that I have here from the PowerPoint, they sought Jesus to conform their control over righteousness. They expected Jesus to, Jesus, when he was with them, he used this word work with them. He tells them to do not work. A little bit later, we're going to notice from verse 27, do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life. So what this, at least in their understanding, he wanted them to not just seek after the things that was going to spoil, but also whenever, again, people like to be in control of their own reality, their own destinies. When righteousness becomes a matter of effort, which means doing the right things in the right quantity, maybe in the right manner, maybe pretty much tell me everything I can do to make myself righteous. But righteousness in this way becomes all about the person doing the work. It becomes all about their effort. Again, in the Morris commentary, which we mentioned earlier, Jesus had already said, "This food I give you." Now he completes the thought as he corrects their view of attaining righteousness. "I am the source of a right life before God. Your work is to trust in my work." Jesus replaces their works of God with the singular work of God, but one thing is needful, and this one thing he makes plain, which is faith. They must believe on him. The work of God means that which God requires of man. There's a sense in which to believe is also to perform a work. But again, the only work God wants us to have is to have faith that he is going to work. We notice it all throughout the New and Old Testament. God has never wanted anyone to trust in the object that he provides. He wants them to trust that when they obey him and respond to him in the way that he says to, then he's going to go to work. but also vice versa. If we fail to not respond to God in the way that He says to, then He cannot work, because it means we are not responding to Him in a way to where it is of faith. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing comes from the Word of God. It is a way that allows us to completely be, at least when we don't understand how it's going to work, okay, God, I'm still going to do it. Let me go ahead and still continue to do what you want us to do, and I'm going to obey you anyway. It's that kind of faith that allows God to respond, because sometimes we don't always know why or how it's going to happen. It's just going to happen. But it can't happen unless we obey God the way that He says to. The next thing that I have here, and hopefully I'm almost out of time, but the next thing that I have here in this PowerPoint, they sought Jesus to tingle their spiritual curiosities. If following Jesus is more than feeding physical appetites, let me go ahead and go back to my camera, and following does not bring with it a detailed list of righteous works, then the reward must be in the experience that is here. What miraculous sign then will you give that they may see it and believe in you? Just think, they were looking for someone to do a sign that was greater than the sign of Moses. Just remember, Moses responded to millions, a nation of millions. God used him, or he responded in a way to where he was able to provide bread over a period of 40 years. And Jesus just comes and he provides bread to 5,000 people just on this one day right here. So, again, they were looking for this prophet that God was going to send to be someone that did so many things that they thought was going to be greater than what Moses did. But see, Jesus corrects their perception of things here once again. It wasn't just Moses who gave bread. God, the Father, provided the bread. Moses merely just instructed the people on how to receive it. But even now, the Father is giving us bread from heaven, and it's up to the people to learn how to receive it in order to have this life. The experience is not in the bread, it is in the Father. The last thing that I have here, going back to verse, again, we're on the fourth one. Again, hopefully we're reading the verses. I'm actually kind of just paraphrasing with these verses right here. So hopefully we're looking in the text as we're going along these different points. Number 4, they sought Jesus to satisfy the appetites of the flesh. So again, going back to what, let me go back. Let me take this off. There we go. Okay. Just as the woman at the well requested, so they too reply. From now on, give us this bread, which we notice here. Totally and blindly numb, and also disregarding all respect that they could have had toward the blessing that Jesus gave right in front of them, and maybe trying to understand the spiritual meaning of the words, they continued to say, Lord, always give us this bread here. If I had this mentality, or if we had this mentality to where maybe, and it could even be with a prayer life, maybe it's also in a weak prayer life. Maybe we pray in this way to where God isn't as powerful to us. And maybe we only go to Him whenever we need something that is a physical need, completely disregarding every single thing that He's given us to at least, do you not understand why you even have this amazing opportunity to not just approach God freely, but approach Him freely anywhere at any given time that you have? When we go back and we look at Galatians chapter 3, whenever he talks about how the Spirit of God, He poured out the Spirit of God and put it into their hearts, and now they're able to cry, His creation and His people, they're now able to cry out, Abba, Father. It's this relationship here, this relationship that only God could have given us because we were unworthy when we messed up. But when we approach God, there's a meaning behind that. There's a meaning to how we approach God, because we're supposed to give Him all the reverence, all the respect that we can possibly give, because it was something, and what He did was something that we didn't deserve. And now, again, not only do we have a tendency sometime to do this, but also these people were going to Him in this understanding, saying, Lord, always give us this bread. Never fail to supply us with this wonderful physical bread. But they wanted a king who could feed, and who would feed their desire for prosperity, their self-determined righteousness, and also just their wonder. How many times do we notice that they ask Jesus for a sign, and we notice that a generation, or a people who's perishing are the ones who ask for the signs. Let me give you something to think about. I'm 2 minutes out. I'm about to close. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. Here are some questions. What do people expect to get out of coming to Jesus? The misplaced motives aren't much different 2,000 years into the future. Some people only come with this understanding that when we read Matthew 6:23, when it says to seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and what? All these things will be added unto you as well. Some people only come with the understanding that all these things will be added to you as well. And they don't come with the seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness part. Again, it goes back to what I said before. Only following Jesus so close to be able to receive the benefits, but not so much to where it's going to require something of you. The second thing that I have here, and again, some only look for the physical things that we gain in our spiritual life for Jesus as reasons to seek Jesus, but it's mostly physical. But again, they only want those benefits. What is your price for following Jesus? So here's a better question. If it cost too much of you, will it get you to stop following? If anyone, and he says many times that if we want to be disciples of Jesus, then we have to deny ourselves and take up our cross daily. If we go through the Beatitudes, we notice that he says that following Him is something that if we follow Him, we're probably going to be persecuted. But what is it going to cost you? What is your price? What is it if something else were to come along that were to bless you better in a physical way? Would it get you to stop following if it meant that you were able to have all of this stuff? The next question that I have here, what is it that if it should go away would cause you to stop following Jesus? What if it's your acceptance? What if people start to not like you? What if it's your family? What if you get to a point to where there's something going on, and there's a wrong that's going on that just needs to be addressed, and some people are just quiet about it because they think that, well, if I were to say something, that means that person's not going to like me. But if you don't say something, you're over here asking yourself, it could possibly hurt their life, but they're wanting to accept it. But if I don't say anything, can I honestly say I really love that person? What if it's your acceptance by people? What if it's your prosperity? Oh, hey, this is costing too much of me. What if it's helping someone? What if it requires you to give up so much of your personal time that you have with people, or that you have for yourself, and once that is given up, then once that is violated, then maybe we want to start pushing away this Jesus thing. What if it's something evil that maybe we're keeping in the shadows that somebody found out about? We realize that the light is shining on it, people are aware, and we have to give it up. Are we going to give it up, or are we going to just push those people out to avoid the confrontation that comes along with it? Because we know that God's word, whenever you follow Jesus, there is a change in lifestyle that has to come with it. This next thing right here, and I think I'm not sure if I put PowerPoint back up, but what false motive is there that when it is no longer met would cause you to turn aside from your walk of faith? Why are you really following? What if the preacher leaves? Are you going to stop worshiping? What if the people that once influenced you spiritually started having a contaminated spiritual life and it felt like you couldn't go back to them anymore? Is it going to kill your desire to continue to serve Jesus, or are you going to serve Jesus? What if it is in a place to where something no longer is performed at a congregation anymore? What if it's a difference in a preference about how we should do things? Would it change a focus from works to be done, or the kingdom heart of a disciple to be lived out daily, if to be lived out daily if it is something that we are no longer doing anymore? Again, would it cause you to turn away from your faith? There are things that and reasons as to why we seek out Jesus. And there are motives that we have behind those reasonings that, even sometimes we try to put up a front. We try to say that, well, I'm really in it for this, I'm really in it for that. Whenever we know, honestly, whenever we examine our hearts and we really compare ourselves to how Jesus lived and how he walked, we're going to come up short. But he allows us to see the flaws in the way that we say that we're following him. So, closing out, I think I already closed out PowerPoint. Okay, I did. But my last final thought, going back to the very beginning. Our reality is something that we can create. But when God's reality comes in, sometimes it exposes our reality in a way to where we start to see the flaws of it. But you have to be honest with yourself. Is it going to be something that you're going to pursue and continue to follow if it violates the what is contained within your reality? Or are you going to throw it out and reject it and stop paying attention to it and say that we continue to serve God even though we don't align our reality up with God's reality that is